All right, here we are with the final lecture in our agriculture unit, and we're going to focus in on pesticides. So that is chapter 23 for those of you that plan on doing your reading to accompany this lecture. Now just a heads up here, we're kind of hitting bits and pieces of chapter 23. We're not going to do every last little detail involved there. If you were to read pages 534 through 550, you should catch everything we talk about, plus a few details we did not talk about. Still good to know nonetheless. All right, our primary focuses for this lecture, we're going to define pesticides, and we'll differentiate between first and second generation pesticides. I'll discuss pros and cons of their use. I'll discuss health concerns of overexposure to pesticides. And then we will also define and describe integrated pest management. Okay? So delving right in, what exactly is a pesticide? Well, it's usually some sort of chemical application. All right? And we often use what are called broad spectrum pesticides, although not always. But a broad spectrum pesticide is a chemical agent that's designed to kill a variety of organisms. Right? And not necessarily just the targeted organism. So maybe we have a mosquito issue and they spray DDT, which we actually don't use in the U.S. anymore. But DDT would be a broad spectrum pesticide. So yeah, it might do a number on mosquito populations, but it would also go in and affect any sort of insect. Okay? Now, originally, when we first started using pesticides, we used actually some pretty darn nasty things like lead and mercury, nicotine, and pyrethrin. And these are poisons, all right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to put poison on your food, right? So we moved on to the second generation pesticides. We noticed relatively soon that putting poison on our food is probably not the best way to control insect populations because we have to just really wash and clean our food so well, right? So then we started generating this new class of pesticides, and they are synthetic poison, but the quantities and the types of poisons they're using are harmful to insects, but generally not too harmful to humans unless we're absolutely overexposed to them. So DDT, for example, was touted as a really powerful insecticide. So insecticide, by the way, means it kills insects, but more or less harmless to humans. So there's this propaganda footage here showing the spraying of this pesticide to control mosquito populations on this beach, right? And you've got people hanging out, kids running and playing right there. Okay. So moving forward, we'll talk about DDT specifically in class, and how it's related to that book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, but we'll come back to that later. More in terms of definition. Now, herbicides versus insecticides. So insecticides, as you might guess, are designed for killing insects. Herbicides are things like weed control. Okay? So the Roundup from the Monsanto company that we talked about back in our discussion of GMOs, right? Roundup is an herbicide. It's a contact killer. You can spray it on things and it'll kill them, except for those Roundup-ready plants that were genetically engineered by the same company that makes Roundup. All right? So insecticides kill insects. Herbicides are weed control, designed to kill weeds. All right? So just a couple of important terms for you. So what are some benefits with the use of pesticides, right? Well, one of the benefits that we don't often think of is the opportunity to use them as disease control. So fleas, lice, and mosquitoes, because of the nature, they're sort of parasitic, I guess. They have the ability to spread diseases. And in places in the tropics, malaria, is pretty rampant, right? And primarily transferred from human to human or organism to human, because of mosquitoes. Right? And so by spraying pesticides in heavily populated areas in the tropics, we can help control those mosquito populations and also help to control the spread of malaria. So that's a potential benefit of pesticide use. Of course, you and I would associate most pesticide use with crop protection. All right. So it's not too uncommon to see airplanes flying over crop fields spraying pesticides. It's a pretty common practice. Before pesticide use, I mean, we used to get these massive insect infestations that would just completely wipe out particular crops, right? You can even hear about them. There's biblical references to these locust swarms, right? And locust swarms are real. I mean, they really will. We're talking millions to billions of locusts can come in and devour an entire field in no time. All right. So pests can eat and destroy about a third of the world's crops without pesticide use, right? And so farmers, for every $1 they invest in pesticides, the return on that investment is $3 to $5. So it's a pretty good return, even though it may cost a lot for the plane or to hire somebody to come and spray pesticides. Their return on every dollar spent is $3 to $5. So it's a pretty darn good return. All right. Now, of course, the problems with pesticides, one of which is just like antibiotics, right? Pesticides put pressure on a population. Not every insect is going to be susceptible to whatever pesticide, right? Because of genetic variations. Some of them are resistant to that particular pesticide. And by wiping out the non-resistant insects, we're removing that competition, and natural selection over time breeds insects that are resistant to the pesticides. All right. So if you look at this graph, for example, between 1950 and the mid 1990s, we can see the number of resistant insect and mite species that were resistant to a particular pesticide over time, right? Just like we see again, the antibiotic resistant bacteria, we get pesticide resistant insects over time. Okay. Also happens with weeds, by the way. We're seeing lots more plants now showing some genetic resistance to Roundup, as a matter of fact. All right. So pesticide resistance, this is often referred to as the pesticide treadmill. All right. And the reason for that is what we see happening over time. We still get a pretty good return on investment with our pesticides, but just like we want to protect our antibiotics and make sure they're useful for when we absolutely need them, we want to do the same for pesticides, right? Because what we start to see happening is that return on investment that farmers get has been slowly decreasing over time, right? So they're having to either apply more pesticides more often, or a larger variety, or in larger quantities to make them more potent. Okay, so their effectiveness is decreasing, all the while we're having to apply more and more, put more and more time and energy into their use. So that's what that pesticide treadmill refers to. Okay, and so what we do is we implement strategies of resistance management, and we will talk more about this near the end of the lecture, but just a little teaser, something called integrated pest management, or IPM. All right. So there's things we can do to help limit the amount of resistance that occurs over time. Okay. So another example, right? And we can look at this idea of creation of new pests. Again, these resistant strains of bacteria. We get resistant strains of insects. So what we have are untreated control trees. Right? And this dashed line shows where the insect population is big enough to where we get economic injury, or essentially, we're having a severe impact on the profitability of that crop, right? If we look at the control trees, right, we see the pest populations, of these red scale, insects stay relatively low. All right. And this is not treated with, any sort of pesticide. They're just left. And so on. So there is some injury to the plants, right, with them. But look at what happens. We have DDT treated trees, right? And we get this massive increase in the density of these red scale insects, all right? And that's because we applied DDT. Now, what DDT did, Okay, it was a couple things. Number one, DDT is a broad spectrum insecticide. So it not only kills the bad insects, it also kills a lot of the good insects, including insect predators. All right. And in doing so, this was twofold. So we saw the breeding of this DDT resistant red scale insect, but we didn't see an associated increase in the predator population. And therefore these DDT resistant insects were able to populate with essentially no control from predators, etc. All right. So we see that there are problems with the overuse or improper use of pesticides, just like with the antibiotics. All right. Now, another really important thing, and when we do some more work with toxicity, and I know we're beginning to do that already in class a little bit, there's two really important things. There's what's called bioaccumulation and biological magnification. And they are related, but not exactly the same thing. So there are certain compounds that nature is not good at breaking down. Lead and mercury are actually natural compounds that are both bioaccumulate and magnify, okay? But many of our pesticides are persistent. And in their persistence, nature doesn't do a good job of breaking them down into simpler materials. So they're persistent in nature. Now, because of that, they have these persistent molecules have a tendency to build up to higher concentrations inside the tissue of organisms. All right. And so what we see is, it might be a relatively low concentration in water, for example, but the organisms that live in the water might build that up to a higher concentration in their tissues because they bring water in and water leaves through the intake and waste process, but their bodies aren't good at processing some of these molecules, so they end up getting stored in maybe the fat tissue of a fish or something like that. So that is bioaccumulation. Now, what we see happening is we see it accumulate maybe at the base of the food chain, and what happens is it gets to a higher and higher concentration as it moves up the food chain, and that's that biological magnification. All right. So accumulation is the buildup within an organism's body. Biological magnification is the ever more rapid increase in concentration as you move up the food chain, because none of the organisms are able to process certain chemicals. Okay. We'll look at some more examples and graphs of that in our toxicity unit, but it is important in the context of pesticides as well, because many pesticides do this. All right. So moving on, risks of pesticides to human health. Now, again, we've moved on from these nasty poisons like lead and mercury and nicotine, and we moved on to much less harmful poisons. Okay. So when you and we eat an apple or a strawberry or something, usually we wash that off. Pesticides are pretty water soluble, so we should be able to wash those pesticides off and be okay. All right. We're talking more about maybe farm workers who are dealing with much higher and much more intense exposure to these pesticides. So you and as long as we wash our fruits and vegetables, we don't have to worry too much about ingesting too much pesticides. Farm workers, on the other hand, if they're applying pesticides or picking these fruits and vegetables, they get a much higher exposure. All right. And so, short-term effects of overexposure, nausea, vomiting, headaches. If you get like a really drastic exposure, you could even do damage to the nervous system. Okay. More long-term effects. Now, disclaimer here. Many things like cancer and lymphoma, breast cancer, sterility, these things happen naturally all the time. And so, relating these types of issues directly back to overexposure to pesticides is difficult. Much like they had a really difficult time convincing people that tobacco was linked to lung cancer, because people got lung cancer whether they smoked or didn't, right? And so it's getting enough data to show that there's an increased likelihood right? And that's kind of where they are with overexposure. Long-term overexposure to pesticides could potentially lead to an increased likelihood of some of these illnesses, okay? So I just want to make sure you understand that these don't directly cause, it's just long-term overexposure, increased likelihood is the way to picture that, okay? Now, alternatives to pesticides. So how can we go about maybe using fewer pesticides, or in some cases none at all? So there's lots of ways to go about this. First of all, we can go to interplant mixtures of plants, right? So again, if we plant one type of plant, whatever insects really like that plant, they're going to go nuts, right? And that population of that insect species is going to go up. If we plant lots of different plants, we tend to control populations and increase competition with various pests, okay? Proper timing of planting, so we could try to make sure that we don't plant so that we coincide with reproductive cycles of insects. Rotation does much of the same thing as interplant mixing, okay? And then, of course, bringing in biological controls, okay? But we must take care that the introduced agent does not attack unintended hosts, like the cane toads, right? We want to try to bring in probably native predators. So around here, bringing in ladybugs or mantises or letting the spiders hang out, right, can help do that for us. Okay, so those are alternatives. Now, all these alternatives in combination with pesticide use, or what we call integrated pest management tools, right? So we bring in resistant crop varieties. We use particular natural enemies, so the insect predators that are native to that area, right? Cultivation practices by interplanting crops or crop rotations, right? Now, all those things are great. They're not going to completely eliminate pests, but if we can use these, right, in addition to pesticides, what we can do is we can have a nice, substantial decrease in how much pesticide we use. So that helps the farmer save money on one hand. It helps reduce the amount of genetic resistance that builds up over time. And it's been pretty successful. So integrated pest management takes a lot of practices to help control pest populations, but it doesn't necessarily mean we don't use pesticides. We just use them judiciously to help prevent overexposure of people, and also, of course, help prevent the breeding of resistant insects. All right. So very accessible. If we look successful, not accessible, successful. So if we look at this particular graph, we can see rice production over time in Indonesia, and we see pesticide use. Now, notice increased pesticide use, increased production of rice. Now, right here, we see an important point of the graph because we see a drastic decrease in pesticide use, but we do not see a decrease in rice production. Rice production continues to rise, all right? And the reason for that was the introduction of integrated pest management strategies, right? So we were able to drastically reduce the use of pesticides without, and that's the key, without reducing rice production in this case, right? So it's a successful program that needs to be tailored to each part of the world and what's available, but these integrated pest management strategies do work, and you kind of get the best of both worlds with them. All right? That concludes our lecture on pesticides for now. We will do some follow-up in class. Peace.